Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the 2025 NHL entry draft for the San Jose Sharks. A few days ago, I discussed what the Sharks might do with their first-round pick, the second overall selection, and today we'll be discussing what the Sharks might do with the other first-rounder they have, the one acquired from the Dallas Stars in the Mikael Granlund trade. Now, we don't know exactly just yet where this pick will land because the Stars are still playing in the Stanley Cup playoffs. They're in the Western Conference Finals against the Edmonton Oilers, but I suspect that they will probably end up losing that series from what we have seen thus far, which will give them 30th overall to go along with the Sharks' own second round pick, which, because they finished in last place at 33rd overall, giving the Sharks two picks in pretty quick succession, almost one right after the other. So for the purpose of this video, we will be discussing both of those selections. Now, there are some key differences to discuss when it comes to the picking late in the first round to picking early in the first round. When you have that number 2 overall selection, there's a pretty narrow list of names to go for. You have Matthew Schaefer, Michael Misa, Porter Martone, Anton Frondel, James Higgins. There's about a 99.9% chance that the Sharks end up drafting one of those players I just mentioned. You don't usually see reaches at this point of the draft. It is possible for sure. For instance, last year with the 3rd overall pick, the Anaheim Ducks surprised everybody, including the player himself, by drafting Beckett Seneca. That was definitely an off-the-board choice, but I don't suspect that the Sharks will really want to rock the boat too much. They'll likely end up making a pretty obvious selection with that 2nd overall pick, but late in the first round, this is really where teams' draft lists can really start to diverge, where the Sharks could be looking at a group of players that is entirely different from a group of players that, for instance, the Colorado Avalanche might be looking at. And then both of these groups could be completely different from what public scout opinion is. So this is really where you will start to see guys who are projected to go in the 20s end up going closer to the 40s, and then vice versa, guys who are projected to be that mid to late second rounder who end up being a late first rounder, especially in this year's draft, whereas it is expected to be somewhat weaker than usual. There will just be certain players drafted simply because there's like a scout on a team that really likes them and they're willing to reach at that particular position. And the reason I mention this is because despite having 5 names on the board here and the fact that the Sharks have 2 picks that they will be making very close together late in the first and early in the second, it is very possible that none of these 5 players end up getting drafted by the Sharks. I could even have a list of 10 names and there would still be a decent chance that none of those 10 players would be drafted by San Jose because there's just so many possible names and I don't have the inside information to know who exactly the Sharks are keeping a very close eye on at this point. But that doesn't mean that we can't try to predict who the Sharks will be looking at with some players who definitely fit into that Mike Grier style of mold. On top of that, as you get to the latter parts of the first round and into the second round, you start to move away somewhat from having to pick best player available. At number 2, you want to take someone with an incredible amount of talent. You're not going to pass on an incredible player just because they aren't the perfect fit for your team. But late in the first, unless there's just like a really obvious name on the board, like Chernyshov was last season as like a mid-first rounder who somehow was still available at number 33, you can start to maybe look at what your team really needs within the organization. And for the Sharks, where they have a clear moment of weakness is on the right side of their defense. Already, their defensive prospect pool isn't the greatest, but they obviously have a few names, Sam Dickinson being the big one, Shakir Mukhamadullin, Luca Cagnoni. But what all these players have in common is that they all play on the left side. Even if by some miracle the Sharks are able to grab Matthew Schaefer with the 2nd overall pick, he is also a left-handed defenseman. So trying to address the right side is definitely a major priority for the San Jose Sharks this offseason and can help be addressed through this draft. Now, the problem here is that, as per usual, it's pretty slim pickings in this area. The few names that are available in the first round likely won't be there at 30 for the Sharks to actually take. The closest name is probably Blake Fiddler. He might go in like the mid-20s. The Sharks, there's a possibility for them to, let's say, package the Dallas first rounder with like a 3rd round pick to try and move up a couple of slots. Perhaps that's something they'll look at if, let's say, Fiddler is available at number 27. They could jump up those positions to try and grab him. Otherwise, however, the next real bigger group of right-handed defensemen start more so in like the middle pack of the second round. That's who the Sharks could perhaps use their 53rd overall pick acquired from the Fabian Zetterlund trade from the Ottawa Senators. They could use that 53rd overall pick to try and grab a righty, but there is someone who could fall into that 30s range that could be very interesting for the Sharks to take a look at, that being defenseman Henry Brzustewicz. And the reason he's a very notable name is because he spent this season with the London Knights, the team of the Sharks' top defensive prospect Sam Dickinson, as well as Kasper Halttunen. So this is probably a player who the Sharks have been keeping a close eye on thus far, because naturally you would expect that the Sharks have one or two people who have been watching Dickinson and Halttunen's development thus far this season, and at that point, you might as well kill two birds with one stone and also see how Brzustewicz's development is going along, especially since, being that right-handed defenseman, he could be a very crucial pick for your team if you feel as though he has what it takes. There is a good amount of offense here. He moves well, he skates well, he'll jump into the rush, he'll contribute offensively, he has a pretty good shot. There's obviously a tendency to maybe feel as though that since he plays with the London Knights, his offense could be somewhat inflated, because there's a lot of great players on London who he gets to play with on a consistent basis. But on the other side of the coin there, the benefit of playing with this team is that he does get to participate in these very meaningful games, and especially as a defenseman, where you will occasionally be tasked with having to face those tough assignments. This is a situation where Brzustewicz has shown some success. The London Knights had an absolutely insane playoff run. And while Brzustewicz hasn't played much with Dickinson thus far in the OHL, the London Knights are currently participating in the Memorial Cup, a small tournament for the best teams in the CHL. They've played 2 games thus far. In both of them, Brzustewicz has actually found himself on the top pairing with Dickinson. Considering the Memorial Cup is a short tournament, every single game is incredibly important, and so him to be placed in this top role, it is a glowing recommendation from the coaching staff. I'm sure the Sharks are keeping an even closer eye on now how this Memorial Cup has been going. I think Brzustewicz has played rather well, and so this could be a solid selection in this 30s range for San Jose that is not only a good player, but fits a need on top of that. Next, we move on to a couple of power forward type of guys. This is a type of player that the Sharks and Mike Grier in particular really like, and this is also the position in the draft that he usually looks for this type of guy. In these last couple of years, it is actually the only player who they have taken. In the 2023 draft, with their late first rounder acquired in the Timo Meier trade, they grabbed Quinton Musty. With their second rounder, they took Kasper Halttunen. And then last year, with their second rounder, they grabbed Igor Chernyshov. All 3 of these players are big-bodied wingers who aren't necessarily hyper-physical, but they won't get bullied off the puck. They have a bit of a mean streak to them as well, and they know how to score goals. And so why not add a couple of other players of that type to the grouping here, to that prospect pool? Both of these players play a pretty similar style of game, and so they will have very similar strengths to it. First, we'll start off with Jack Murtagh. He is a player who always has that constant motor, always is trying to give it his 100% on every single shift. He skates pretty well. He is someone who will play physical, who will get to the front of the net, who will do whatever it takes to actually get your team the victory, and so he'll be willing to take a bunch of cross checks to try and just push in one of these like garbage type of goals near the crease, those rebound styles. But that's not the only thing that he offers up. He has some offense to his game as well. He played on the power play with the U.S. National Development Program, which is where he spent this season. He was a one-timer option. He scored a lot of his goals from this exact position. And so he can have that potential ceiling of being like a second liner in the NHL. I'd probably more so put him as like a third liner, maybe along the lines of a Colin Graf. But still, this is the type of player who can be very important for your organization, especially with the Sharks here now picking in 2025. By the time that these are players who will actually graduate to the NHL, maybe at the earliest 2027, probably closer to 2028, at which point the Sharks roster will be a lot more established. Guys like Celebrini and Smith will be on their first major extensions. They'll be making a ton of money. The Sharks will have a lot of their salary cap tied up into their top 6, into their top defenseman, into their goaltender, and so they'll need cheaper options to play for them on the third defensive pairing in the bottom 6, and that's where a player like Jack Murtagh can come in as that maybe rookie or that sophomore type of season on his entry-level contract, be a cheap option, but a very good one at that. Score some clutch goals for the team, even if it only ends up being like a 30-point type of season. He can definitely be that style of player because he is just that never quit, never say die type of attitude. When it comes to Bill Zonon, very similar style. He also is always going at 100%, is willing to do whatever it takes, is really trying to help out his team in whichever way possible. He's physical. He'll win the battles along the boards in the corner. He has that size to his game as well, but also a decent offensive option, perhaps even a slightly higher ceiling in that area than Jack Murtagh. That's arguable, but he's got a pretty good shot, but also some really solid passing. So another very interesting option. The major difference, I would say, between these two players players. First of all, Zonan is a good bit older. He has an October birthday, which means he is one of the older players of this draft. He was 18 for the majority of this season, compared to Murtag, who actually has a late August birthday. He's still 17 right now. He'll be 17 for a couple of months after the draft actually concludes. And at this age, those extra few months of development are quite notable. So there's maybe slightly more room for growth for a player like Murtag. On top of that, Zonan played in the QMJHL, which is one of those 3 CHL leagues, but is definitely a step below both the OHL and the WHL at this point. If you look at, for instance, last year's draft, in the first 2 rounds, 64 players taken, 25 of them came out of either the OHL or the WHL. Only 1 of them came out of the QMJHL, the 59th overall pick. Now, the Q is making a bit of a rebound this season. Caleb Desnoyers is expected to go like a top 5, top 7 selection. But the point being here is that the Q is a little bit of softer league. There's not as much defense being paid there. And so for someone like Zonan, who has that physical development already and is a little bit older here as an 18-year-old, he has the ability to get points a bit easier than maybe somebody else does. And so that could be somewhat of an inflated point total for him. He had well over a point per game this season, but still, both of these guys, because of that effort level that they are constantly putting in, they're players who it's hard pressed to see them not being able to make the NHL, in the very least like a 4th line style of role, so could be solid pickups. Now, I could just continue naming these power forward type of guys for the rest of this video, and that would obviously be like still pretty good prediction, because again, Mike Greer loves this style of player, but that also wouldn't really make for an interesting video. And so we'll move on to someone a little bit different from that. William Moore here, a centerman who does have some size. He's 6'2", but doesn't quite play that physical style of game, more of a scoring option, but also a bit of a two-way style of guy. He was a player who, coming into this season, people were somewhat high on, was viewed as a potential top 15 selection, but a weaker beginning of the season kind of started with him falling down the draft boards. He finished off the season strong and actually had a really good under 18s performance with the United States, but still is viewed maybe as like a late first rounder at this point. He's got some solid playmaking ability. He moves pretty well. He can be someone who competes for pucks decently, even if he needs maybe his wingers to actually do a little bit more of the dirty work for him. But he can definitely tie a line together rather well, but he's not just effective in the offensive zone. He is someone who, at least, by an 18-year-old standards, can give you some decent defensive play. He worked on the penalty kill. He was solid in that area, so he could end up being like a decent two-way third-line center for yourself in the future. Obviously, the Sharks have a bunch of these styles of players within their system thus far, but as they say, you can never have too many centers. It's one of the most important positions in hockey, and so this could be a solid selection for the Sharks anyhow. And then the final player to talk about here, definitely the most interesting in my opinion, but also perhaps the most controversial, that is Ivan Ryabkin. For those who have been following the 2025 draft for a while, you'll know that at this time last year, he was actually projected to be a potential top 5 selection. Not quite at the level of a James Higgins at number 1, but someone who could be that top 5, top 3 type of pick, because he had had an absolutely amazing year in the MHL in his D-1, and it was expected he'd follow in the footsteps of guys like Ivan Demidov or Matvei Mishkov, and then carry that into the following year, his draft season, and end up being that top tier pick. But it hasn't quite played out that way. He got a couple of games in the KHL, didn't manage to hang around, but that's not the end of the world. The same thing happened with Demidov, but the thing was that when Demidov went back to the MHL, he was absolutely dominant. 60 points in 30 games. That is 2 points per game. Clearly far and away the best player there. That made him still a very interesting selection in 2024. Ryabkin, however, didn't have that much success. Even though he had been really good as a 16-year-old, now as a 17-year-old, he took a few steps backwards. In the 15 games he played, he had just 12 points and notably only 1 goal. As such, he started to fall down draft boards quite considerably. Bob McKenzie had him at 5th at the beginning of the season. By the time January rolled around, he was viewed more so in the 19th position, and some people had him even further back. Now, Ryabkin ended up making a really interesting decision around this point, which is he decided to get out of his contract with his Russian organization and come over to North America, where he ended up in the USHL playing with the Muskegon Lumberjacks. And this ended up being a really smart choice for him because it allowed him to finish the season very strongly. He was actually a point per game for Muskegon over the final 27 games of the season, season that he did play. And this isn't like junior hockey in the CHL where you can sneeze and end up as a point per game player. There's only a handful of them in the USHL every year, and Ryabkin was one of them. But on top of that, he was also a really solid playoff performer. Muskegon would actually end up going on and winning the Clark Cup, which is the USHL championship for the playoffs, and Ryabkin was their second leading scorer in the playoffs still. So a very important piece of that roster. It hasn't quite helped him get further up the draft boards for a couple of reasons. The first of which is that the USHL isn't the greatest league. Obviously, if he was putting up like over point per game numbers in the NCAA, that would be an entirely different story. But in the USHL, it's not like extremely impressive or anything like that. And on top of it, there were some pretty clear weaknesses in Ryabkin's game back in Russia, and the fact is that he didn't quite improve in some of these areas. First of all, his skating isn't the greatest, certainly not NHL level, but his defensive effort is a big question mark. Obviously, not a ton of these young players are going to be great defensively, but in the case of Murtag and Zonov, for instance, while they're not amazing in their own zone, you can tell that the effort is there. With Ryabkin, it's a little bit more questionable. His effort in the offensive zone, absolutely fully apparent. You can see that he wants to be the difference maker for his team. He wants to score the key goal. He wants to score the biggest or get the big assist. So he's constantly calling for the puck, and he's willing to battle along the corner, in the corner, along the boards, go to the front of the net, try to assert himself in that position. This is not that perimeter type of stereotypical Russian player. He will fight for his space on the ice in the offensive zone. Absolutely. He's not going to get pushed around, and he got like a decent amount of size to be able to hold his own, 6 feet, 200 pounds. But in the defensive zone, he's a little bit more of a floater. He's waiting for the play to go the other way, and he's hoping that his teammates will be the ones to actually spark that type of transition. He's not looking to do it himself. For like a comparison's sake, you look at someone like Macklin Celebrini with the Sharks, you know that you're always going to get that consistent 100% effort in every single zone, neutral, offensive, defensive. Not really the case with Ryabkin, which calls into question some potential attitude issues on the ice. On top of that, there is some penalty troubles here with this particular player. Now, this can be spun as both a good and a bad thing. He had 70 penalty minutes in just 27 regular season games here for Muskegon, and while a handful of those were definitely minor penalties, that's just never really a good thing. 40 of those 70 penalty minutes were dedicated to either misconducts or major penalties. He got kicked out of the game twice this season in just 27 outings. That is a pretty big deal, and it shows that he is crossing the lines more often than not. Even in the playoffs, he had another misconduct on top of that, another 10-minute penalty there. So this is a player who will have kind of a short temper. Now, I said this is a bad thing in the case that it does cost his team quite dearly, but can also be viewed as a good thing because it shows that his heart is in the game. He's willing to be physical. He's willing to respond when he's faced with adversity on the ice. It's just about trying to rein it in a little bit, get him to walk that line where he can be that effective power forward guy who's willing to throw a hit, who has the insane offensive talent, but isn't necessarily going to cost your team so dearly by staying in the box. A player who I think is actually a pretty good comparison is a former Sharks first-round pick, Ryan Merkley. Now, this is maybe not a glowing comparison in the sense that you would think anyone who compares to Ryan Merkley is someone who the Sharks should stay away from, but there is a slight difference. First of all, Ryan Merkley, while he had that insane offensive talent, he didn't have much of an interest in playing defense, and as a defenseman, that's a major problem. And there were also some very real attitude issues reported off of the ice for Merkley. Compared to Ryabkin being that forward, it's not as big of a deal if the defensive game isn't quite there. You can hopefully coach that into him, and his attitude issues remain more so like an on-the-ice type of problem for him. And so what you can clearly see here for this player is that he has very high upside and then very likely also possibly a bust. But the thing is that the Sharks are in a position where they can absolutely take on that risk. Many people will say the Sharks have one of the best prospect pools in the NHL. Some will even go so far as to say that the Sharks have the best prospect pool in the NHL, especially when it comes to their forwards. They also have another 2 first and second rounders that they have this season and next year, so they're just further adding even more talent to this group. And so for a player like Ryabkin, we're late in the first round. Usually, as I talked about with all of the 3 previous forwards, you're looking at guys who maybe are like second liners at best, but likely more so in that bottom 6 range. a player like Ryabkin has the potential to be a top-line player for yourself, even if it's not a really, really high likelihood to actually occur. But I do think the Sharks are in the position where they can take a flyer on this type of player, and even if it's like a 1 on 10 chance that it actually works out, the fact that it could land and it could be such an absolute major victory for your team, I think that could be a fantastic selection. Now, the major question is whether or not he'll actually be available at number 30 or number 33, because the fact is that some people think he could go in the 20s, others believe he might fall down all the way to the 40s. There are definitely going to be teams in the draft who have him on their do not draft list, and then there's definitely going to be teams in the draft who are willing to also take that risk, and before the Sharks have the opportunity to do so. I don't necessarily think he's a player who the Sharks will like trade up for or anything like that. They're not going to move up a few spots just to try and grab this player, but could the Sharks use one of these 2 picks to grab him? I personally wouldn't hate it, and we have seen that Mike Grier is willing to trade and draft Russian players. He grabbed Kostin, he grabbed Askarov, he grabbed Chernyshov, he grabbed Mukhamadullin. This is a potential fit for Mike Grier still, and again, this isn't some perimeter, smaller Russian player. This is a power forward type of guy who absolutely could be that Mike Grier style of player. But that will do it for this video. Obviously, there are a ton of options that the Sharks could go for. This is a position in the draft where it's hard to really be like disappointed in the moment. I would say these are guys who are project players who will need at least 2-3 seasons before you are even thinking about them actually being able to make it to the NHL. And so we shall see what Mike Grier decides to go for. Class dismissed.